Christianity tends to think of itself as a moral beacon, and that without it, the world would slip into disarray of moral and sinful chaos and inevitable catastrophe. They usually look at other religions with contempt as immoral, uneducated, ridiculous, and sinful, and use their perception of other religions to further validate their own standpoints. But when I look at Christianity, I personally do not see any beacon of morality. I do not see them as a lighthouse on the stormy waters of immorality as the world. I see that at best they are just like the secularists. They are just like the pagans, just like the witches, just like the agnostics, the skeptics, then the atheists. But at worst, I see they are far worse than any of these things. They imagine these other groups to be, and historically speaking, I can certainly validate that they have committed far worse atrocities than any pagan group ever has, or that any atheist group ever has, or that any witches' coven ever has. Never in history have witches tortured and killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The pagans did not hunt down and force Christians into conversion under the threat of death and through physical torture. And no atheist campaign has ever ransacked Christian communities and stole their houses, stole their finances, nor silenced their life works or imprisoned them for simply speaking the truth. Only Christians have committed these atrocities. So it makes me curious, do they really have any form of moral superiority? They claim that they do, and their claim is that they have the teachings of Jesus Christ to guide them and direct them, and that they have the 10 Commandments to steer them towards a greater good. And many claim that if the whole world would simply follow these 10 Commandments, then the whole of humanity would be all the better for it. Yet, to date, I have not seen humanity benefit in any way, shape, or form from the 10 Commandments. I have seen political tyranny result from these teachings. I have seen mass genocide take place from these teachings. I have seen corporate greed and overreach result from these teachings. I have seen slavery come from these teachings. I have seen ecological crisis and deterioration come from these teachings, but not a lot of love. Certainly not a lot of good, not a lot of kindness and humanitarian works. I have seen nothing to benefit the life's sake of all that exists on this earth. In other words, any good work seems to be a result of ulterior motive. Financial. Yes, the church needs those finances. They thrive on money that they sincerely call the root of all evil. But don't forget to tithe 10%, they say. So, do they really think that money is the root of all evil? They seem to thrive on it. They use that as an ulterior motive for a lot of their humanitarian work, their good deeds, their charitable functions, so on and so forth. But then we also see the ulterior motive of conversion. Many missions are not just to feed the hungry. They are not just to get clean water to third world countries. They're not just to help drug addicts to recover or to clean the streets up. No, it's never good just for goodness' own sake. It is good to try gaining fellow church members. It is good for a reason, for a cause, to grow the church's attendance, to create more revenue, which arguably is completely central on the financial motivation of the church leaders and their position. Because, in short, church is ran like a business. And the congregation is very much akin to a customer base. And then there is the ulterior motive of heaven and hell. And this is from the church leadership all the way down to the occasional Sunday practitioner. Because heaven and hell is what forces the moral actions of Christians. Christians yearn for that pie in the sky, and they are scared to death of eternal damnation. These are the factors which really keep them in check and keep them in line and make them quote unquote good people. But as Nietzsche has said, and has pointed out by many skeptical philosophers such as Bertrand Russell, Voltaire, even myself, and a lot of my books and my videos, that if you need this fantasy, this fiction, or this fairy tale to make you good, and to keep you good, and to keep you in line, then there is nothing really good about you. You might just be fooling yourself, but nobody else. And Nietzsche goes as far as to say that those who need this fiction or this fairy tale are the worst kinds of degenerates imaginable, and have no capacity on their own to act morally. So the question I have to ask, are the Ten Commandments really doing the world any good? Are they really doing us a solid? Are they making life better for anyone? Christians would still argue that they are, and are still protesting to get them into schools and onto public buildings and government facilities, and signing petitions, and certainly group signaling via their social media, reposting things advocating for the Ten Commandments, that they need to be broadcast far and wide, so on and so forth. But do Christians actually even know what these commandments are, let alone live by them, or really, actually, sincerely believe in them? Or is this all just merely instinctual group signaling, acting instinctually on tradition without actual knowledge of what they are advocating for, speaking loudly without knowing what they are actually saying? In 2016, Lifeway research study had shown that only 20% of American Christians have read their Bible in its entirety. They broadcast this as if this was a good thing, but I viewed this admittedly pessimistically. I read that as 80% of Christians have not read the Bible in its entirety. 6 years later, in 2022, American Bible Society reported that only 10% of Christians who own a Bible actually read it at all outside of church services. And church services only cover abstract and out-of-context passages in order to appeal to the masses of the congregation. In other words, they pick the prettiest thing, the thing that's going to speak to the most people, they doll it up, take it out of context, and of course, neglect, reject, and completely ignore the contradictions or the negative aspects of the Bible. So reading in church services is practically useless, and you might as well just formulate your own fictitious belief system and cherry pick your Bible boldly and proudly, for this is all that church service is. It is Bible cherry picking. And you pick your flavor based on the church, for they all cherry pick a slightly different flavor to suit different tastes, and that's why you get different mentalities in these different church settings. Now, this is also only factoring in those who own Bibles. There are some Christians in America which have no Bible at all, and so far to date there is no study to give definitive numbers on this, but we do know there are certainly Christians without Bibles in their home or in their possessions. So this would account for yet another sway in the statistical numbers that we're looking at. And I believe that this is why, looking at this research, it is clear that Christians really do not know their Bible. They don't know their Bible because they do not read their Bible, which is probably why they can maintain a belief in their Bible. Because as Mark Twain had said, the best defense against Christianity is reading the Bible. And this has certainly been my own experience. I was a Christian, and I was most Christian when I didn't read that horrific book. But after 15 to 20 times of reading my Bible and various translations of the Bible, even Greek and Hebrew, I found too much darkness in it. Far too much hatred, too many historical inaccuracies, and too many self-contradictions. The Bible, in other words, turned me away from Christianity. But those who have not read the Bible seem to be its biggest advocates. Yet in the same way, research has shown that over 80% of Christians believe that the Ten Commandments should be taught in school. and should be posted in public buildings. But when asked to recite the 10 Commandments, and remember, there are only 10 commandments, 10 big ones in other words, that they are advocating for, less than 14% could accurately do so. More embarrassing than this is that around 50% of Christians actually believe that the Golden Rule is one of the 10 Commandments. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Golden Rule, this is the aspect of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Spoiler alert though, this is not one of the 10 Commandments. And this is not even specifically Judaic-Christian. This is also found in many pagan teachings, very specifically the Greco-Roman pagan teachings. And only single-digit percentages can tell you where to find the 10 Commandments within the Bible, with a very large amount of Christians believing that they are found in the New Testament, and a staggering amount believing that the 10 Commandments were actually a teaching that came from Jesus the Christ. The 10 Commandments were an Old Testament concept. They were part of the Judaic law. They were not taught by Jesus. They were not even mentioned in the New Testament, not even once as a passing side note. And this arises some difficulty for Christian scholars who actually study the Bible and try, albeit unsuccessfully, to make sense out of the Bible, because it is debatable if the 10 Commandments even have a place in the Christian belief system, or if they are just a sentimental relic from the mother religion, which is of course Judaism. But admittedly, most Christians do not face this logical difficulty because they do not pay enough attention to their own belief or the context of the things that they hold most dear to. But from a logical point of view, this is a thing to be considered, and a thing to be considered with extreme weight. Christians advocate for the 10 Commandments, but the first major question we face is, are they advocating for a thing that is even applicable to their own religion? This, of course, is not a question I will attempt to answer here. That is a job for theologians. But it is the first shadow of doubt to be cast over the authenticity of the idea of superiority concerning the Christian moral system. Furthermore, though, we find some serious logical errors in thinking that God commands fundamental morals, or morals which are universally applicable or acceptable. And this boils down to the philosophical debate that we now call the divine command debate. Does God command what is good, or is a thing good because God commands it? If he commands what is good, then that means there is good which can be found without God, or without his religion, or without this goofy, flawed little book that everybody seems to cling to but never reads. And therefore, any individual can live a good life and could have insights into what is good, because good exists beyond the Bible, beyond Christianity, beyond the religious formalizations that we see in our modern world. And any religion can also have access to this same good. Therefore, Judaic Christianity has no special affiliation to morality or that which is objectively or subjectively, however we want to consider it, good. Now, if a thing is only good because God commands it, then potentially God could command horrific, terrible, naughty, nasty things like rape or mass murder, and it would be good. But is this actually good? God could be a diabolical monster commanding things which are detrimental to the human species and to life on earth, but we justify it and say that it is good just because God commanded it to be so. Malum se, malum prohibita. The old Latin motif, that which is evil on its own, that which is evil because it is prohibited. This has been an age-old debate concerning laws in general, but in other words, there are some serious philosophical questions that arise when we say that God commands good, and therefore the 10 Commandments are fundamentally good according to this Christian concept. But philosophically, there's some serious doubts associated with this ideology. But the biggest problem I find, and which sheds some light on the divine command debate, is that there are not just 10 commandments, there are actually 613 commandments. And oddly enough, one of those 613 commandments is not to reduce the commandments. In other words, i.e., not to subtract from them. This is found in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. It says, "Do not add to the commands or take away from the commands that I have gave you. Keep the commands that I, your Lord, your God, have given you." So immediately, in the 613, we see not to reduce them, but somehow we've managed to reduce them to 10. Is this not odd? Does this not immediately raise a red flag? Because to me, from a logical, deductive reasoning standpoint, it certainly does. But let us take a quick look at some of my personal favorites from the 613 commandments, such as Deuteronomy 23:20. This says that you can loan to foreigners at interest. In fact, in some versions, like the NIV, the NSV, or ESV, so on and so forth, it says that you should loan to foreigners at interest, but not to your fellow man. First of all, every loaning institution around the world, every bank, Jewish or Christian owned, breaks this command. Secondly, this is seemingly slightly nationalistic, we have to admit, maybe even perhaps mildly racist. But thirdly, this was a law to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. So being that I, Blake J. Watson, am of European heritage, does this law necessarily apply to me? Does it apply to the rest of the Gentiles that I work with, that I'm related to, that I associate with? Does it apply to any of us living in the United States of America? There are some serious questions to be asked about this command, and one of those questions I would like to pose is, why is God concerned with our money? This is a very human construct, and a very late, very modern human construct in context to our evolutionary history. So why does God get involved with our money and with our finances? And furthermore, is this really actually moral? Another one of the commands that really sticks out to me is that if a brother dies, then the other brother is to take his widow and impregnate her and give her children or kids. So the brother-in-law of the widow has to have sexual relations with her and raise a family with her. This is not suggested, this is not implied, but commanded. This is a practice called the Levirate marriage, and it was very common in the Middle East during the time that the books of Moses, which were not actually written by Moses, and we most certainly know this, were written, and shows how influenced these commands were and the ideas of the Jewish religion were by time and space of where they came from and where they originated. This command, of course, in case you want to look it up on your own, is found in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. But then in Exodus 21, verses 2 through 6, and in Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 through 17, we see that it is fine to own slaves and is even advocated for by God himself. And in today's world, this seems ghastly to even imagine. And in North America, it is one of our biggest blemishes and one of our biggest and greatest embarrassments is the fact that we actually owned slaves and used slaves to found and build this country. But biblically, it gives us a full-on green light to go ahead and own slaves. So again, I have to ask, is this moral? We in our modern day would say that it is immoral, and logically so, because we are taking into consideration the well-being of other human beings. But the Bible does not do this. The Bible says it's fine. The inspired Word of God says it's good, go ahead, have at it, do it, have as many slaves as you want. It only has one stipulation: you have to let them rest or take a break or take a leave every 7 years, then you can get new slaves. Then the commands say that if you rape a woman and are caught, the big emphasis here is and are caught, then you have to pay her father a fee. It says nothing about not raping, which most of us would agree should be a command. It should be in one of these 613 commands, but at not one point did God or the conveyor of these 613 commands ever think, hey, we shouldn't rape women. That never once came up, but it says, hey, if you do rape a woman and you're caught, you have to give her father a fee. It simply says if you rape a woman, which seems to be permitted to a degree, and are caught, all you have to do is pay her father this fee because she is the property of her father. This is not only immoral, but is bigoted and misogynistic to say the least, and it is just a small glimpse into the grotesque and vile nature of the Bible. And this is found, of course, in Exodus 22, verse 17. Later, we see rape seemingly permitted yet again, and in a very dehumanizing way to the woman, as if rape itself wasn't already dehumanizing. And this is in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29. And here it says, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not yet pledged to be married, and he rapes her, and they are discovered, and I'm going to take a break here for a second. This again means that if they are caught, he shall pay the father, her father, 50 shekels of silver. And this, of course, was the bride price. You bought your brides in this culture and in this time, and then you must marry her and cannot divorce her according to this command. Again, this shows that women were only merely property, which could be used and bought and sold. It also does not say don't rape. Again, there's no implication that you shouldn't rape. It pretty much just says don't get caught raping. That's realistically how we can interpret this. Then in Exodus 22:18, we see that murder is not only permitted, but encouraged. It says, do not suffer a witch, or a sorcerer in some translations, to live. This was the Bible verse used to justify the killing of hundreds of thousands during the witch hysteria which gripped Europe and the New World, and was the basis for the book The Witch's Hammer, which has been deemed one of the most dangerous books due to the amount of lives that it cost, just under the Bible and significantly before Mein Kampf, which was written by Hitler. So this is an actual commandment to murder witches. But are not one of the 10 commandments to not murder? Indeed, this is true. You're correct. That is very accurate. But are you starting to see the hypocrisy here? Are you starting to see the self-contradictions here found within the Bible? Thou shalt not murder, but kill witches. And aside from the countless commands that we would call immoral, found within these 613 commands, we also see commands that are testimony to the fact that this religious doctrine in its entirety, in its totality, was set up for financial gain and, for lack of better terms, political power. We see that priests and temple servants get special treatment. They get to eat foods that others were not allowed to. They get special clothes and are exempt from various strains that the common man had forced upon him. We also see that tithes were required, that 10% of your income was due to the church, which of course would be enjoyed by the temple servants, by the high priest, so on and so forth, and that taxes were part of these commands, so that you had to pay into this system, this formalized ideology. So it all boils down to luxuries and financial benefit for the elite, which of course is leeching off the work and sufferings of the poor or the lowly. And then there are tedious and goofy commands like do not sow different seeds in the same field. And we have to ask, how is this good? What makes this good? What makes this moral? And why does God necessarily care? Are there not different types of plants growing in the forest and so on and so forth? This is just absolutely silliness. Then we see dietary restrictions, which are completely non-commonsensical. And we see commands like do not mix cotton and silk in your wardrobe. the real moral stuff, the fibers of all morality. But not once do we see anything saying to enrich your intellect, or to take actual care of your body, or to take care of the planet and not to destroy it, or to smile and be friendly and mind your manners and be kind, or to not make other people's lives difficult. In other words, we see nothing actually moral in any of these 613 commands. But let us just forget about the other 603 commands. Let us look at the 10 commandments, what are actually being advocated for by the Christian mythos of the modern world. And let's hypothetically pretend that these are the only commands found in the Bible, and see if they offer any sort of moral superiority, or if they are crucial to the moral foundations of this world. The very first command that we see, we should suspect is a proud one, a significant one which is crucial to the overall well-being of this planet, and crucial to the existence within nature, crucial and critical to us and how we get along with our fellow people, and overall benefiting the human species, or at least that's what we should think, using logic and reason, critical thinking, in other words. Number one, and other religions are always the most important. They are the things that you are to remember and commit to memory first and foremost. But here we see something less than moral. Command number one says, "You shall have no gods before me." First of all, Mark Twain made the point that this is not denying the existence of other gods, and it's not even saying that you're not allowed to have other gods or serve or worship other gods, just not any gods before or above Yahweh, or hold them as superior to Yahweh. And furthermore, it doesn't say that other gods are not superior or better than Yahweh. We are just not to hold them as superior or better than Yahweh. But is this really moral? How does this benefit the world? How does this make life better for anyone? It is not something conducive to strong moral character. It does not develop well-founded principles. Instead, it only seems to stroke an ego of a deity. It demonstrates God's famous jealousy, which we all know about, and which he seemingly prides himself on bragging about within the Bible. And then we have command number 2, "You shall not make any idols." The world would be much safer, it'd be much cleaner, much happier place if only there were less idols. Does this not seem a little bit goofy to call this moral? But firstly, this is based on a miscomprehension. Pagans are what this command is directly referring to, and pagans had idols, and Jews and Christians thought that the pagans actually worshipped and prayed to these idols, that the idols were the gods and goddesses themselves. The Christians and Jews did not understand orthopractic doctrines. They did not understand myth, nor did they understand symbol nor metaphor. They took these actions as literal. They thought that the idols were the gods and goddesses themselves, not just a symbol for them, which historically speaking is not the case. So this command is based on a flawed understanding. So is it valid? Furthermore, is it divine? Is it God who misunderstood what the pagans were doing, or was it the writers of the law? And if there is a difference, does this not break down the legitimacy of this command? Secondly, this is mildly, I'll go ahead and say it, extremely hypocritical, because Christians make idols. The cross is an idol. The statues that we see of Jesus and the Virgin Mary are idols. Technically, paintings of Jesus are even idols. And for the patriots of the United States of America, this means that your flag is also an idol. So it is bad news all the way around when we actually look critically at this command. And again, we have to ask the question, is this sincerely and truly a moral command? Now we arrive at command number 3. Do not take the name of your Lord in vain. Again, this is an ego stroke to Yahweh. Is this moral? Would the world be better if when you're sitting in traffic or somebody cuts you off and you didn't say Jesus Christ? Or when someone jumps out and scares you and you say, oh my God, what moral benefit does this have? How can this increase the quality of life in general? That is the question we have to ask. And if we can't come up with a legitimate answer, then we have to attest to the fact that this is not a moral command. So now we get to command number 4. And this one says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But those who did not keep the Sabbath day holy, or who worked on the Sabbath day, were punished corporally, usually stoned to death. So stoning someone to death for working on a certain day was okay. That's good. That's God's work, in other words. But working to take care of yourself and your responsibilities and your family on a certain day is sinful. It's evil. It's villainous. This just simply makes no sense to me whatsoever. So far, these are not proving to be moral at all and are laughably ridiculous under the scope of logic and reason and in contrast with historic knowledge and other biblical passages. Now then, let's see what command number 5 has to offer. This one says, honor your mother and your father. Finally, now halfway through, we're finally getting to something that is arguably moral. Not necessarily moral, but arguably moral. Albeit this is not a moral that Christianity has any special or significant rights to. Many other religions believe it is a good thing to stay connected to your ancestors, to honor your elders, both deceased and living, and to maintain a recognition with your heritage. In fact, no other religion does this as good or as significant as the pagans did, but they did not broadcast it as a command/law, nor as a moral code or a rule. They just did it out of cultural preservation, and they did it with sincere meaning and with conviction. More so, they did not limit themselves to such black and white bleak landscapes of specific doctrines like we find in the formalized Judaic-Christian religion, because there is a moral question that could be applied to this. What if your mother or your father is a bad person? What if they do not deserve respect or honor? What if they are a treacherous human being in the most horrid of ways? Then are they still supposed to be honored, and are we still supposed to honor them? Wouldn't this in turn be immoral if they were actually bad people? So in other words, supposing that everything is hypothetically easy and all things exist in a black and white state seems to be a little bit nearsighted. It seems to be very limited in its understanding. And this is supposedly coming from an omniscient and omnipresent God that's commanding these things. So if it's nearsighted, why is it nearsighted if it's coming from an omniscient and omnipresent God? One would suspect he wouldn't limit things to such simplified terms, knowing that things exist in gray areas. In fact, most things seem to exist in gray areas. So even though this command can be moral, there are instances and circumstances where it is actually immoral, and therefore throws a semi-skeptical light on the writer or the creator of the command and the overall command in and of itself. And now we arrive at commandment number 6, which says, you shall not murder. This is a moral statement, surely, but it is odd that we are now 60% of the way through the 10 Commandments before we get to a command which is actually and empirically moral and beneficial. But what is more odd is the fact that God commands murder on many occasions and turns a blind eye to many murders committed by his followers. So what does this mean? Do not murder, especially in light that corporal punishment was a law of the Old Testament for transgressions like working on the Sabbath day or taking someone's livestock. And one was commanded to kill witches. That's part of one of the 613 commandments, which were largely pagan practitioners in the lands which the Jews took over, and later the lands in which the Christians stole for themselves. And what about the endless religious wars? Is it not murder even if it's done in mass or in battle? So yes, we can say that this is moral, but is it a moral which Christianity adheres to or has ever adhered to? That, I believe, is a fundamental question to understanding this particular commandment, and is a moral that seems to not be supported by the rest of the Bible. Furthermore, what religion does not adhere to this? So again, nothing unique or special here about Christianity. It shows no moral superiority no moral insights that we simply can't find in any other religion. And this begs the question, why are the 10 Commandments so important? And now we see command number 7, do not commit adultery. Agreeable. This is a bad one, and is a moral statement for sure to say do not commit adultery. Is it the most significant moral statement which could be made though? No. But we are at least finally saying something that is moral, so that is a good thing, but again, not really one that Christians have placed emphasis on, even in their own practices. And in the Old Testament, we have to ask ourselves, what was adultery? Because within the Old Testament, this seems to be a very ambiguous aspect, because men were permitted to have extramarital affairs. Women were not, of course, allowed this luxury, but they could also have, men of course could have multiple wives and could have consorts, which in other words were prostitutes. So what does adultery actually mean if not sexual intercourse outside of marriage? This is a difficult question to answer in the lens of religion. If we make the statement from a secular or non-religious standpoint, it is easy to define. Don't have extramarital affairs, don't have sex outside of marriage. But the waters are extremely murky and muddy from a Judaic-Christian standpoint, and yet again, no other religions would disagree with this. In fact, pagans of the Gaulish territories, the Celts, had an extremely formidable maritable practice, and their rites were extremely adhered to and practiced in a very strong and sincere manner, far more than did the culture that we see in the Old Testament, and far more, even more so than Christians of the modern world who are consistently getting divorced, watching pornography, so on and so forth. But now we come to command number 8, and this says, do not steal. Historically, this is laughable since Christians stole everything they seem to ever come upon. From political power in the Roman government, lying, conniving, manipulating to get means and goals and to insert themselves into places of authority, to the pagan temples, which they took by force and ran the pagans out, converting the pagan temples that is, to their own churches, to endless land and finances from victims of the various crusades, hundreds and thousands of farms, homes, family heirlooms stolen by Christians. So theft was never a thing that Christians really blinked twice at, but they claim it as one of their 10 primary principles. This just to show the hypocrisy of the Christian ideology. But again, it is noteworthy that even Satanism agrees with this morality. Even Satanism would say that it is a bad thing to steal. So we see nothing significant, nothing new, nothing insightful, nothing groundbreaking or special here. And now we arrive at command number 9, which says, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, or i.e., do not lie. But Christianity never batted an eye at lying, especially if it was to support their religious expansion. However, I admit I am not trying to make this whole video about the Christian hypocrisy or the history of Christian hypocrisy. Nonetheless, still a moral statement that we cannot deny, but not the greatest one that we could certainly imagine. Now then, command number 9, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, or i.e., do not lie. But Christianity never batted an eye at lies if it was to support the furthering of their religious ideology or the expansion of their religious cult. However, I admit I'm not trying to make this whole video about the history of Christian hypocrisy. Nonetheless, still, it is a moral statement, and we cannot deny that it is a moral statement, but certainly not the greatest one that we could imagine. We have still not seen any moral statement about not raping, about not being mean or unkind, or about protecting children or not harming children. Nothing about spiritual cultivation. But we do see this 9th commandment, which is do not lie. Not to mention the fact that everybody lies. In fact, it seems as though language were invented so to perform the function of lying. And if you say to yourself, "Oh, I do not lie," then that in and of itself is a lie. And if you truly believe that you don't lie, then you are only lying to yourself, but lying is a fundamental reality of this life. But lies, albeit annoyances, are not particularly a thing to be proud of, but they're not detrimental to the ways of the world, and are not even a peripheral topic of the things that we really and truly need to worry about as far as sins or immoral acts. But then last but not least, we see the 10th commandment, which is do not covet. And I am still alarmed at how few people know what it actually means to covet. To covet means to yearn for a thing, or is a strong desire to possess a thing. This is a translation into English, which is pretty accurate, I might add. In Hebrew, the word is kamad, and it literally means to covet, obviously, but it also can be used in context like taking pleasure in or taking extreme delight in. And the context of this 10th commandment is simply not just to covet. It doesn't just say, oh, don't want something. It says, do not covet anything that is your neighbor's, his wife, his horse, his house, his donkey, his servants, anything at all. In other words, do not want anything that your neighbor has. But this almost seems like an impossible command, or at least one with some applicable issues. How can you control what you want? You can control how you behave with your wantings, yes, but to control what you actually want and what strikes a chord of desire within you is almost impossible. And of course, this is not factoring in the simple psychological truth that we can't control what we want, and it offers no expansion on this idea. It keeps it black and white, and it keeps it rather vague. And by and large, it keeps it up to personal interpretation. In my years of Christian belief, I've heard this interpreted in endless different ways. And with that being said, with the many different interpretations, is it possible to actually consider this a universal and fundamental truth of morality? Hardly possible, I would have to say. But that is the total of the 10 Commandments. That is all 10 of them. Not really the most moral beacon in the world, not as morally superior as many suggest that they are. Not even hardly a good moral suggestion. And I might say, if a person just lives by the 10 Commandments, the world would not be better. Far from it. If only the 10 Commandments were followed, this would be an absolute hell. It would make this entire world insufferable. It would be a toxic cesspool of unparalleled proportions. So I think the 10 Commandments are not necessarily the most moral things that we can live by. I think they are futile. I think they are rather useless. I think that they are a joke. And I think that other religions, other philosophies, other myths, and other practices offer way more legitimate moral codes and conducts. Even Satanism offers a more thought out and better moral principles than we find within the 10 Commandments. So to me, they're laughable at best. but in their harsh and brutal realistic form, in their full reality, they are a red herring that distracts many from what it actually means to be moral and to live a moral life.